Joseph wants to do the right thing. Mary has been found to be with a child that is not his, and it would be perfectly acceptable for him, as we read the story, to let her be publicly shamed and disgraced and probably worse. But it tells us that Joseph is a righteous man and that he wants to do more than what is acceptable. He wants to do what is right. And so he resolves to quietly dismiss her instead of publicly shaming her. Now, in our day today, I think we strive to do what is right. How many of you as a little kid got drugged by your parents somewhere to apologize for something that you said or did? That's how we teach our kids what is right. Now, there's also what is acceptable. Example might be a kid takes something from a store that they don't know yet that you have to pay for, and you might have them take and put it back, and that would be acceptable. But we want them to do what is right, so we drag them over and also make them confess and apologize. Now, most of life is probably not that complicated, and what is acceptable and what is right are often the same thing. So when you do go to the store and you pay for what you have and leave, that's acceptable, and it's the right thing to do. But sometimes what is acceptable and what we might think of as the right thing to do aren't the same thing. And we have to work a little bit harder. And it's complicated. I remember the last 3 years of my IT career, I knew I was going to seminary. It was a 3-year plan of saving money and getting the calendar squared away so that we could figure out how to sell the house and move away and do what we were going to do. And as we were planning that, I knew that eventually I was going to have to quit my job with my consulting company. And it would be perfectly acceptable for me to give them how much time? 2 weeks. But it felt like I should work a little harder at doing what was right. Now, the thing with the consulting company is their resources, their people. And so 3 years out, if I had gone and said to them, listen, I'm on a 3-year plan. I'm eventually going to go to seminary, and I wanted you to know that. And let's say 2 years out, my project comes to an end. Well, I'm the resource. And for 2 years, they could probably say, well, yeah, we can still get some work out of him. But what if it's 2 months out that my project comes to an end? Maybe they look and say, well, we don't have anything for 2 months, so we're going to have to let you go. So I was wanting to do more than what was simply acceptable, and instead do what I felt was right. But then what was right for my family maybe wasn't the same thing as what felt like it was right for how I shared this information with my employer. And so I didn't really tell them. However, I was at a client site, right? So I had a manager that worked for the client. And for a lot of reasons, including that he was just extremely trustworthy, I did tell him because that felt like the right thing to do. Now, what would have been perfectly acceptable was for me to give my company 2 weeks and let them tell him eventually. But I told him like 3 years out, and we worked on a plan for how I would transition out. And I was hoping that we could draw my company into that conversation eventually and maybe backfill me. But my project ended up, my role was disappearing about the time I was quitting. So it worked out really well. But here I was kind of living this, it felt like a double life for a while because I had this career manager from my company who was super excited about managing my career and getting me promoted and like growing me as an IT person. Well, I'm over here going, well, that's all nice, but we're getting closer and closer to me not ever doing this again. So thank you very much. But I lived in this weird space of what was acceptable and what was right, and trying to figure out how to do those things and struggling with that. And certainly it wasn't right that the client knew, but my company didn't know. But that felt okay. And then eventually my career manager quit, and I got to get a new one, so I asked if I could pick. Because there was another guy that I trusted and had known for a long time. And then I did tell him and say, can you help me navigate this? And I don't remember, I probably just did give the 2 weeks notice ultimately, and that was acceptable. Maybe it wasn't quite the right thing, but that was a hard thing for those 3 years living in that space, trying to figure out what was right when what was right for my family and my company might have been different, and having the client in there. And I share all this just to say doing the right thing is not always an easy thing to figure out. Much of our days, what's acceptable and what is right might be the same. But then we can get to places where they're not, and it can get harder. Even more so if we flip from being righteous like Joseph to self-righteous, and what we think is right, maybe we want to impose on others. I think of a family where the parents long felt like divorce is never an option, and then the child gets divorced, and then that creates tension. Why? Because one side is saying, that is not the right thing to do, and the other side is saying, gosh, it sure felt like the right thing from where we were at. And that two different understandings of right can get complicated. The other space where it can get tricky is if what I think is right and what you think is right are different, and we're trying to negotiate life together, right? And so if we have something we're trying to work out, and you think one thing is right, I think the other is right, what am I going to say to your propositions? You're wrong, or no. Now, no is a word that cuts off forward movement. No is a word that is sort of an end. Yes can actually be that way too. Have you ever talked to somebody and you're trying to get, hey, can we, and they're not really paying attention, and then they just go, yes, yes, yeah, they're not really thinking about it. So no and yes, right, they're not always forward-moving words. And so if you think about this experience with Joseph, he's got resolve to do the right thing. He's a righteous guy. The angel could have come along and just said, no. Well, if the angel says no to Joseph, what does he do the next day? He hasn't been given a new idea. He's thought he was doing the right thing, and now he's left in a space of now trying to figure out, well, maybe what's acceptable is the best I can do, because what I was going to do and I thought was right, I've been told no. And that's the way it can work in our lives if we hunker down sometimes in what is right, and we've tried to go beyond what's acceptable, but if we get stuck sometimes in that place, we can say no, and that cuts off all forward movement. But that's not what happens in this story. The angel comes, and the angel actually doesn't say the word no, and the angel doesn't say one of my favorite words, which is the word instead, but the Spirit is there, right? The angel basically says, no, Joseph, you're not going to do that. Instead, you're actually going to marry her because this child is going to save your people, and you're going to name him Jesus. Now, I love the word instead, because unlike the word no, and sometimes the word yes, instead actually requires thought. Instead is a word of invitation. It is a word that can take into places of creativity. It's a word that moves things forward. So the angel comes and says, no, instead, you're going to do this. And if you think about the life of Jesus once the baby grows, he walks around the world and he gets told no all the time. When he does maybe what's unacceptable, like healing on the Sabbath. You could say, well, Jesus did the right thing. But when he talks to the people, it's always in that space of instead, right? They say, you can't do that. He says, no, instead I can, and here's why. And in all of those places, what Jesus does usually leads to life. It leads to healing. It leads to new awareness. It leads to wholeness. And so Jesus is always dragging beyond what is right, but into this instead place of new life, which is what the angel does with Joseph. Yes, you did more than what was acceptable, right? You were resolved to do what is right, but what is right still wouldn't have been fantastic. And so the angel takes Joseph to this place of instead, and it's a life-giving place. It's a place that brings Mary into a relationship that will ultimately bring Jesus into the world and a family and in a place where he can be safe and nurtured and whole. And so the angel is always pointing Joseph, right, towards this life-giving space, which is what Jesus does as he grows. It's also what Paul does. There's in the early church these debates about should the Gentiles have to follow the food laws and should they have to do circumcision. And lots of people are saying, well, of course they should. And others are saying, no. And Paul says, instead, why don't we be a little flexible? And if you're around somebody whose faith is weak and they need to eat and follow the food laws, then follow them with them. And if you're around somebody that doesn't need to, then don't, right? This doesn't have to be yes, no, and stark. Paul's saying there's a life-giving space in here where we pay attention to where people are at on their journey, and we bring that life-giving support and accompaniment and community to them where they are. Instead is also my favorite part of Martin Luther's explanation of the Ten Commandments in the Small Catechism. There's 10, right, of the commandments. Most of them have a giant no in the middle of them. Are you supposed to murder people? No. Steal? No. Commit adultery? No. Covet? Bear false witness? It's all no, no, no. 8 of the commandments in Luther's explanations say instead. So don't murder. Instead, work to protect the life of your neighbor. Don't steal. Instead, work to help your neighbor maintain and keep their property. Don't bear false witness. Instead, always speak positively and put your neighbor's actions in the best positive light. Now, that one I love because in the Large Catechism, he qualifies it and says, even if you know the gossip is true, or even if you saw them do the thing that's bad and you're going to talk about it, even then, instead of saying that, put their actions in the best possible light. And all of those insteads tack on to the end of it something that is life-giving. It goes beyond maybe what is acceptable and beyond what we might come up with that is right and moves into this place of something that is life-giving. This is the journey that Joseph goes on. The angel says, yes, you've gone beyond acceptable. You're going to do what you think is right, given the best information that you have, but here's another way. Now, in our day today, I find this text to be, this week, it was troubling, right? Because I think most of us would say doing the right thing is what we should often be aiming for. And this caused me to ask the question, what if that's not enough? Like, we can celebrate doing more than what is acceptable, and if we can at least land in the place of doing right, we're doing good. And then in this Bible text, that doesn't seem to be enough. And so then I think, gosh, if the best that we can do is come up with what is right in our minds, given the information that we have, and that's not enough sometimes, that's kind of a scary place to be. And then I started to think about yoga class. Probably not where you think your mind would go with that. So I've been going to yoga for a few years, and what I love about yoga is a good teacher will come in and they will invite you to do a pose. And I'm going to do I don't know if it'll work with the robe on, but there's this thing called the tree pose where you get your hands up here and you pick one leg up like this. Now, not everybody has their balance there. When I first started, I would fall over every time I tried to do that. So a good instructor will say, all right, now we're going to do the tree pose. It is perfectly acceptable if your balance is in a place to just put your toe on the ground and put your heel up against your other ankle. So you still have 2 feet on the ground. That's perfectly acceptable. And then they'll say, now if it's in your practice today, or if you would like more of a workout, go ahead and lift that foot up to your calf. And if you can go further, go ahead and lift it all the way up above your knee, and then we'll stand there doing yoga breathing for some period of time. Now that one I can do. But there's other poses that my body literally will not do, right? They'll say, try this, and if it's a good challenge for you today, you can take it to another level, and then if you want even more, you can go further. And there's one where they want you to put this leg over this leg and wrap your toe around your calf. The only way my body will ever do that is if you break my leg. Like, it will not bend that way. And so there are times in yoga class where I just cannot at all do what they are inviting us to do. And I never will be able to. And so I come back then to this idea that much of life, acceptable and the right thing, are the same. And then there's times where it gets more complicated and we have to wrestle with doing the right thing, which is more than what's acceptable. And probably most of our lives, that's a good place to land. But then there are times where still that's not enough. And God is inviting us and dragging us into places where maybe instead of what's right, we should look for what's life-giving. Now, we won't always see that. Sometimes we will. And if we're trying to do the right things and we understand that God is in the business of bringing new life into the world, maybe we'll see those life-giving opportunities and go beyond what's right. But lots of times, like Joseph, we won't see it. And God will drag us there anyway. This is what happens on the cross. Jesus gets put up there with the big no, right? He comes into the world and tries to preach about love and good news and teach people about mercy and kindness and compassion. And the world says, nope, we're not doing that. And then God answers with, instead, I'm going to raise him from the dead, and death is no longer the end of this story, right? And so in that place of new life, God drags us to what is life-giving. So my hope for us as we live into Christmas and beyond is that most days we live through knowing that acceptable and right is the same thing, and then when they're not, and we get pushed into doing what is right, that we trust that God can drag us beyond that when necessary to what is life-giving, and that we can go along for that ride knowing that God's grace is working in us to touch other people's lives as we go. Amen.